Hello and welcome back, and that's right, we want to return to the subject of this. This is the Beelink ME Pro, the brand's new 2-bay NAS solution, and we did a first impressions video on this. We learned a lot about it when we went over to the brand's headquarters in Shenzhen, China, and now we're finally here for the review. We've done a bunch of tests covering thermals, covering performance, power consumption, noise and more, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll decide if this little bugger deserves your data. The TLDR, the system arrives with two different CPU configurations, the N95 4-core processor or the N150 4-core processor, both of them Intel x86 64-bit chips with integrated graphics. They both arrive with, both variations arrive with pre-attached memory, that's LPDDR4 memory. The N95 version with that memory arrives with 12 gig of RAM alongside 128 gig SSD for $369. The N150 version arrives with 16 gig at the top end and 512 gig of storage, and that is $529. The system has two hard drive bays, it has three M.2 NVMe bays, it has a 5 gig network port on the rear, and is by far the smallest 2-bay I've ever seen. To put it into perspective, we'll put that 2-bay there. We've got three other 2-bay devices here that I'll cram here on the table, and these are from TerraMaster, Unify, and from Synology there. It is smallest, I would say it is around 20 to 25% smaller. One of the ways in which they've done that is with the cooling system on the device. More on that in a moment. But even if we stack them up side by side, you can see this is, for a 2-bay SATA NAS device, weirdly small. How they managed to cram everything they need to inside this is kind of surprising, but cracking on. Talking about that design a little bit more, someone else in the comments of the first impressions video probably summed it up better than I did. It looks like a Marshall speaker. I'm pretty sure that's intentional. That is not a speaker at the front, although there is an M.2 NVMe inside there, an M2 key that's used for Wi-Fi, which will come up, by the way, during the thermals. Trust me on that. We have a front-mounted USB with a power button, and on the rear of the device a removable panel that has our hard drive base alongside all of the ports and connectivity there on the base. A 2.5 gig and a 5 gig, no 10 gig here. That CPU, either configuration by the way, only has 9 lanes to play with. It also has USB Type-C, but that is not the power input. The device requires standard barrel power input and arrives with a chunky little PSU. During the first impressions video, I did talk about how I quite liked the presentation in the accessory kit. I recommend you check that out, but one of the things they do is keep the accessories inside the trays. The trays are not click and load. They do require screws on either side. I will say, you can put a drive inside this without screwing it in, although that would be pretty poor form, definitely in terms of vibration. But each tray has a thermal pad there to dissipate some of the heat off of the PCB of the hard drive you put inside. I've not really seen that before. I don't know if it helps in any way towards vibration, although I will say that each of the screw points does have a little rubberized connector there, which does, I presume, limit some of the vibration ever so slightly. These trays directly feed onto SATA connectors inside, combine data and power, but there is no rear mounted fan in there. That is one of the ways in which space has been saved, because all of the solutions I just showed you feature a fan integrated into where the drives would meet. Now this remedies that. You can just about make that out there. There is a fan, but that is that CPU fan onto a vapor chamber there. So that is pulling air all the way through and out the other side, but it's also pulling over the drives there. It'd be very interesting to see at what point during the design process they decided to minimize it that much by placing that fan there, because a lot of systems that use this CPU, by the way, do not have a CPU fan. They rely on the ambient fan on the back of the system drawing enough cooling air over the drives and the M.2s. Talking of the M.2s, this base panel here is modular. You can pull that out, and inside you find our three M.2 NVMe bays alongside the CPU and the RAM, of course, but you don't need to do it that way. There is a base level panel here that you can use the included hex Allen key there to remove underneath and access all three of the M.2 bays there. It's a shame it isn't SODIMM for the memory. I know that's going to annoy some people, but let's face it, the cost of RAM these days is billy bonkers. But at the very least, you've got the three M.2 NVMe bays, and one of the things I found quite surprising is one of those is Gen 3 times 2. The other two are Gen 3 times 1. So there's an extra fast M.2 inside there, maybe for an OS drive, maybe if you're going to use VMs or containers. I think there are some users that are a little bit more disappointed by 5GBE on this, because although 5 gigabit networking, if you're running 10 gig with auto negotiation, you can still take advantage of it. There isn't that much 5 gig networking equipment in the market. And perhaps there is an argument that the distribution of the M.2 is there for a ×2 speed. Something could have been done, maybe reduce it to 2 and add 10 GBE. Who's to say? But the modular motherboard inside there, I will say that according to the official pages, you can swap that out with some of the newer ones that are arriving. So, for example, there is even a 64-bit ARM version alongside an AMD more powerful version in the works. Now, presumably, depending on your operating system, swapping that in and out, hopefully the RAID will carry over from the 2 storage drives. But still, nonetheless, I do quite like the compact design. And just overall, it does the job, and it's not too bad on the eye. But how does that all translate into thermals, into heat and dissipation and temps once we install ourselves 3 M.2 NVMe's and a couple of hard drives? Well, it panned out as follows. After the system been in operation for 24 hours with pretty much hourly access, so that's once every hour for about 5 to 10 minutes, the temps were as follows. On this external chassis, we saw around 35 to 34 degrees on all of the sides, with the front mounted panel peaking, as mentioned earlier on, around the M.2 NVMe into the M.2 key Wi-Fi adapter based there in the front. Now, the base of the system started hitting around 34 to 38. Each of those M.2 there on the base are directly attached with a thermal pad onto that base there panel. So you can kind of make that out there for dissipation from the drives. There's no room for heat sinks to play with. And if we look at the rear of the device, the motherboard and the vapor chamber there was around 38 degrees after that 24-hour period, and the drives were sitting around 34 to 36 degrees. Again, I was using quite modest 4TB Seagate Iron Wolf drives, so again, nothing too egregious. That will also be reflected on the sound. Focusing specifically on that base panel there, when I removed the base level panel that was being used for heat dissipation there, I will say the temperature of the drives of the 3x2 was around 45 to 46 degrees and 38 to 41 on the 3x1, which really surprised me there. I thought the 3x2 would be the one that was getting the hottest there in terms of speed. Now, I don't know whether that's because the other 2 drives were in quite close proximity, or the fact that those 2 bays are actually quite close to the front underneath the main drives and the furthest away from the fan. We'll have to wait and see. But with the panel on top, the temperature of the panel was around 36 degrees over that 24-hour period. Now, noise levels are actually surprisingly modest. We have to at least acknowledge 2 things. Number one, that the 4TB drives that I was utilising here aren't that egregious. If you go for bigger than 8TB or Pro class drives, there will definitely be a bit more noise. But at least in that setup, we saw the noise level while the hard drives were in idle of around 36 to 37 dBA. So that was the drives not being accessed, but the system in standby, with nothing happened with the NVMe's and the fans set to their default state. Now, when we had both drives being accessed simultaneously and 2 of the M.2s being accessed there, not the OS, we saw it at around 35 to 38 dBA. Again, pretty respectable numbers. It's actually a pretty compact fan there. Now, it is worth highlighting with the fan, I didn't really see any means to control the fan outside of BIOS, which is disappointing. Again, it's going to be OS dependent. I'll have to wait and see. But at least in terms of my early testing on this, when I was taking advantage of Zimmer OS and some early Unraid, I wasn't able to control the fan even with command line over SSH. But what about power consumption? This isn't a big beefy device. That CPU is pretty darn efficient. It's still hard drives. It will depend on the drive you choose to use and the states they're in, alongside the M.2 NVMe's. Although bigger SSDs, we are talking single watt variables really. The PSU it arrived with is that barrel PSU at 120 watt, which is actually pretty impressive for a compact PSU. It's a shame it isn't USB power, I will say, but I presume that might have cut into the whole cost side of things. But in terms of the actual power draw, we did 4 different operational setups. First thing I did to get a baseline was to remove the hard drives, remove the SSDs, and just power on the device. And with that, we saw the power consumption of just around 15 to 16 watts, so slightly higher than I would have expected for that PSU. Perhaps it was the connection of the 5GBE for the CPU, I should say, inside there. But still, nonetheless, not too bad a number. Then I powered the device down and then introduced 3 M.2 NVMe. So still no hard drives there. I kept those slots completely empty and powered on the device. That was with Zimmer OS reloaded and ready to go. And that had a PSU a power consumption of around 18 to 19 watts, so not too shabby. Finally, I powered on the device with those 2 4TB Seagate Iron Wolf drives inside, the 3 M.2 NVMe's, but crucially all of the drive media being idle. I saw a power consumption of around 22 to 23 watts. So again, with the 2 drives inside, fairly respectable, I would say, for a system sitting in idle. Finally, I went ahead with full access to both the hard drives and to full access to each of the M.2 NVMe's, and the CPU sitting at 100% utilization. And in that score, the system hit around 41 to 42 watts. Bear in mind, that is full banger bombardment across the network connection, across all of the storage media, the CPU, and indeed a decent chunk of the RAM as well. Fairly respectable for that little 2-bay once we were really hitting it with a hammer. What about performance? Well, it is a 5 gig networking system, and there is 2.5 gig we could have truncated with, but I will say right now, 2 hard drives were never going to saturate the 5 GBE connection. Maybe the 2.5G, depending on your drives. And I had 2 drives in a RAID 1 environment, and the 2 hard drives, the 4TB Seagates there, I was able to get around 250 to closer to 267 megabytes per second. Now, when I accessed the M.2 NVMe, and I was accessing that over the 5 GBE connection, I achieved full saturation. That was the Gen 3 times 2 there. But these are kind of limitations of what the hardware architecture is in terms of external network connectivity. So I decided to go in with SSH and PuTTY and test the drives internally to see what the performance is. Now keep in mind, that CPU is still pretty darn efficient, regardless of the lane allocation of 3x1 or 3x2. That is not a CPU that's going to be breaking any records, 4-core or 4-thread. So for the 3x2 bay M.2 NVMe I had put inside there, and again that is Gen 3 times 2, so a potential 20 gigabit, or realistically it would have seen a maximum of around 1.6 to 1.8 gigabytes per second. It achieved 1.5 to 1.6 gigabytes read and 1.1 to 1.2 gigabytes write. That was a repeated 1 gigabyte file test. Now, what about the 3x1? We should be seeing a maximum there of around 800, maybe 900 on a good day, megabytes per second. On the 3x1 M.2 NVMe, I saw in terms of read around 830 to 835, and in terms of write around 640 to 670. It was a little bit inconsistent and all over there. And when it came to performance in something like Plex, I think a lot of users are going to look at something like this for Plex Media Server. I was able to comfortably play back 4 very heavy 4K RAW files simultaneously, with the CPU only ebbing early into the teens. So again, that was with Jellyfin, played over an extended period. Big files that we've already recorded here for the channel. It performed very well. Now, before we conclude the video, I want to take a very quick sidebar into the storage on this, because there was a couple of things I had questions about. One was to do with the SATA, and another one was to do with the 2.5 and the 5 gig there, because number one, it's kind of weird. There's a 2.5 gig and a 5 gig connection on the rear, but they actually have different branded controllers. So the 5 GBE controller is a Realtek. It's the Realtek 8126, and it's running on a 3x1 lane, so there's plenty of available internal bandwidth there to saturate that 5G connection. But at the same time, it was kind of odd that alongside that, the 2.5 gig was using an Intel controller. I've not really seen many devices that have different network controllers. Only really the Minis Forum device did that. But it's kind of weird to have 2 different network controllers within one device. Now, when it came to the SATA drives inside there, they're running on an ASM 2116 controller, again on a 3x1 lane. So again, for 2 hard drive bays, maybe with SATA SSDs you might, but you probably wouldn't see any kind of throttle. There's more than enough internal bandwidth afforded to that SATA controller. But what's interesting, on the official pages, they say this device does not support hot swapping. For those that aren't aware, hot swapping is when you have 2 drives, perhaps in a RAID 1 environment, one drive dies, you want to take a drive out, put a new one in, start rebuilding the RAID, but crucially you don't want to turn the device off. They say that hot swapping is not supported on this device. Well, during my testing, I thought, you know what, I'll give it a punt. And I could hot swap. I was able to hot swap a drive out of the RAID and introduce a new one. Now, perhaps they're saying it's not possible simply because power fluctuations, maybe the way the power is being distributed across the system, and therefore, just for security's sake, they decided to say that hot swapping isn't possible. But during my testing, I was able to hot swap. I just wanted to include that here because I do think it's relevant, particularly on 2-bay devices, where if a drive fails, suddenly you really are running sand out of that hourglass. It'll come as no surprise to many of you that I chuffing love this little 2-bay NAS. There isn't enough innovation in the whole 2-bay NAS market. Most people really get their muscles in when it starts at 4 bays and above. So it's nice to see someone taking 2-bay NAS devices seriously, and particularly the compact nature of the thing as an addendum to an increasing range of NAS solutions from Beelink following the ME Mini. I'll say I really like what they've done to separate themselves out from the market. I like the design. I think the cost for the N95 version at the very least is very, very competitive and appealing. Although I think the N150 version, again at 529 nicker, I get it for the RAM stuff there, it might have to be a bit more. But at that 500 nicker price point, you've got a 2-bay that's starting to edge into the pricing that most people would pay for a 4-bay and above. The speed and performance for the CPU profile isn't too shabby. And again, it's the design, it's the aesthetic, it's the USP of this device that really stands out. And in terms of noise, in terms of heat generation, in terms of power consumption, all of those numbers left me pretty happy with what I'm looking at here for a 2-bay. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I don't like the fixed RAM. When I met the brand over in Shenzhen, one of the things they were talking about was making more of their devices SODIMM ready. Now, presumably, the AMD solution, the more powerful Intel Core solutions that they're working on in larger storage configurations, they will be SODIMM. I think it'll be surprising if they go down the LPDDR route for those. But it's a shame that it's fixed memory. Yes, 12 and 16 gig is, a decent amount to play with, but I think some users might would have made a saving and used some old SODIMM they might have knocking around. On top of that, the power not being USB-C is a shame. Again, when we go back to the ME Mini, that was using a 2-barrel there. So again, it was kind of inevitable they go down that road, and that's got an internal PSU. I think there will be some users that are disappointed it's not USB-C, and I think there'll be some users that are disappointed that it's not factored in, and that is just another component that could fall out. But to maintain the compact nature, I get why they did it. Also, let's be realistic, 5GBE as a network connection isn't going to be for everyone. And whether that is an existing 10G network that just wants to make the most of the bands and the lanes that are afforded to that CPU rather than see good bandwidth left on the table, they might be happy to see 5 gig there in their auto-negotiated state. But I think everyone else who doesn't really have 5G components will just see it as between 4 and 2.5 gigabytes of wasted network potential. And it's a shame there isn't a 10G equivalent of this device, maybe with some playing around with those M.2 slots out there in the market. But these are small criticisms on arguably one of the most innovative 2-bay NAS devices I've seen in the market for a while. Short of TerraMaster and their whole 2-bay with 3 M.2 shtick that they've been rolling, there are very few interesting 2-bays in the market. And once you start going down the road of wanting larger storage drives but a smaller physical footprint in your home or business, this is an interesting appeal that stands out from others out there. And I'll be interested to see what Beelink are going to do moving forward in terms of pushing the boundary on a 4-bay and bigger version of this, as well as that little tray slotting in and out, and just how much of that's going to work. But what do you guys think? Have you got hold of this? Let me know your experience. Are you interested in learning more? There hopefully is a written review linked below, alongside a few different places to get hold of this for yourself. So if you want to support what we do here on the channel, and if you were going to get hold of this device anyway, and if you were going to visit those stores anyway, make sure those 3 things are true, please use those links in the description. We get a small commission here at NAS Compares, and it allows us to keep doing what we do, the reviews, the written guides, the support and more. But that's up to you. I'll see you next time.